Hi, my name is Jake Greenspan, and welcome to the Greenspan Floor Time Approach. This lecture is an introduction to the Learning Tree and Dr. Stanley Greenspan's DIR model. The Learning Tree was the final book that he wrote with his wife Nancy Greenspan and was his newest way of envisioning his DIR model. We're still going to be focusing on the developmental, individual differences, and relationship-based elements of his model for evaluation purposes and to develop a child's program. But in the final book he wrote, he envisioned this model as a tree. And he really wanted to identify how a child grows synonymously with how a tree grows. So what we're going to look at and start with is where a tree begins growing, and that's in its root system. And that represents the foundation of a child's development. Well, on the screen you'll see there's a blue box, and that blue box is going to represent the roots of the tree, or the foundation that everything's going to build on. Because as a tree needs a firm foundation, or even a building needs a firm foundation, a child needs a firm emotional foundation in order to grow and develop socially, emotionally, and cognitively. So all of the things that we're going to be talking about start to rely on this foundation, which is our root system. Well, what is this foundation made of? Well, you'll see on the screen there's 5 different components to what we call regulation. And regulation, again, is our roots or our foundation. But we're going to say regulation is really the child's ability to stay calm, organized, focused, and take in what the world around them has to offer and understand it. A lot of times children may experience overload from their environment, or they might be a little understimulated from their environment, or mixes in those two systems. And if they're either overstimulated or understimulated, they're said to be dysregulated. Well, in a dysregulated state, a child is unable to truly learn and process the information in their environment and also think and effectively socialize and control their behavior. So ideally, in order to do all the things we need to do to be productive members of society, we have to first be regulated. But let's talk about the things that lead to regulation. The first thing on our list is sensory modulation. Sensory modulation goes into this blue box. What is sensory modulation? It's our ability to take in a certain type of sensation. It could be auditory stimulus, tactile stimulus, even visual stimulus, and have a proportionate and consistent response to it. So we take it in and we respond proportionately. Unfortunately, many children have modulation difficulties, meaning they take in sensation and they are either overreactive to it or they're underreactive to it. Well, in the situation of overreactivity, a child who might experience touch that's supposed to be pleasurable from their caregiver, like their mom, is instead of enjoying the experience, they're being aggravated by it. So how is that child going to react when very early in life, mom, dad, or caregiver comes to pick them up? Well, they're going to arch their back, they're going to scream, they're not going to enjoy and feel the positive support they should be getting from that experience, and instead they're going to become avoidant of it, averse to it, and every time someone reaches down, they might become anxious. The same is true of an auditory system that's more overloaded. And a child who's responding negatively to certain sounds, like a blender or a vacuum, or even a certain level of voice, then instead of learning from their environment, starts to avoid environments with a lot of sounds, especially the ones they might be more reactive to. So for a child who has these needs, it's important we provide them with these inputs throughout their day so they can learn to experience them and activate their nervous system. And whether they're being overreactive or underreactive, our goal is to help them maintain a balance. So sensory modulation is very important for establishing regulation. The next term on our list is motor planning and sequencing. And we see that motor planning and sequencing goes into this blue box, again, which represents overall regulation. What is motor planning and sequencing? Well, it's the ability to have an idea of something we want or something we want to do, come up with a plan, and then execute that plan. An example that we often use in daily life is grabbing something, taking a drink of water, for example. I might have to first realize I'm thirsty and I want water. Then I have to come up with a plan of where that water is and how I'm going to get there, and then I execute that plan. There may be many, many steps involved. Well, the more times I perform that, the easier it becomes and the more unconsciously I do these things. But for the first time, whether I'm learning a new dance move, playing a new sport, whatever it is that might be a new sequence, it takes me a lot more thinking in order to process it. But the more I practice, the better I do. Unfortunately, for many children, a child who struggles with motor planning and sequencing is not going to be able to come up with those steps necessary to accomplish their goal. They might sit there on the floor and not go after the toy they want, or they might get upset because they don't know how to get it. In either situation, we see a child who's then not exploring their environment. They're not navigating it, but they're also not learning how to get their different needs met independently, or even get the help of another person, because in order to grab mommy by the hand, that requires motor planning and sequencing. As does all of our earliest communication strategies, because they all rely on motor system and gestures. And in order to communicate, we have to have pretty good motor planning and sequencing. Unfortunately, what happens for many children is the planning part, or even the ideation part, is done for them. So if we show them what to do and show them how to do it, well, now we're doing the first two steps. All they have to do is execute. So they learn the pattern, they learn how to go up the stairs, they learn how to ask for help, they learn even a sign when it comes to communication. But who's really doing all the work? They're just executing. We're doing all the thinking. So it's really important that when working with a child who has motor planning and sequencing difficulties, we help them perform the activity, but not just execute it. Come up with the plan to execute it for the first time, and even make sure that this is an activity they want to perform. Really, they have their own idea and initiative to accomplish this goal. But imagine if we can't do these things, we have heightened frustration, possibly passivity, and now we have a child who's not really learning from their environment. So let's go to the next term, visual spatial processing. This is also part of our regulatory box. Visual spatial processing is our ability not to see, but it's our ability to understand what we see. As an adult, we might see this from different experiences we have when we're going to another country. Let's say we get off an airplane in a foreign airport and we don't speak the local language. Well, how do we know where to go? Well, someone who might be more visually spatially advanced might look for symbols and see the picture of a bag, and they know that's the way to the baggage claim, and follow the rest of the people, even though they don't know exactly where to go. Someone who might have a weaker visual spatial system might feel anxious in that environment. And they get off the plane and they don't know where to go, and they wait till the crowd's clear, and then they really calm down and think, or they might have to go ask someone. Well, in each of these situations, you can see even as an adult, we're using many of these processing abilities, but it's not our ability to see, it's our ability to understand and organize what we see. A child, on the other hand, they're not worried about the airport, hopefully. Instead, they're worried about where mommy and daddy are. How can they find them in the house? Are they in the room right next door, or do they want them around them all the time? Or even going from a familiar place to an unfamiliar place, such as going from home to school for the first time. Well, imagine a child who doesn't have good visual spatial processing. One of the difficulties they're going to experience are transition problems, going from a familiar place to an unfamiliar place, or even a familiar place to another place they know, but they just don't know it at that moment because they don't really know where they're going. They can't think ahead, which is part of visual spatial processing, being able to imagine where we're going. Another thing we do that really helps us with our visual spatial system is not just picturing where we're going, but picturing mommy or daddy's face. So when we start developing the ability to detach from our parents and go explore and have secure attachment, well, now we really need to understand, where are my mommy and daddy? Can I picture them at home or at work, or can I even just picture their face to calm me down? So what's really important here is the ability to create visual images, to understand how space is organized around us, and how our bodies fit into that space. Many children who have some visual spatial difficulties, they're very good at seeing many of the details in the room, but they don't see the big picture. The analogy my father used to use is they see the trees, but not the forest. Well, if you don't know you're in a forest, you're going to get pretty anxious, and you might even get overwhelmed by the amount of trees you're in, especially if you don't know where the boundaries of that forest is. So it's really important we help children become good detail thinkers, but also big picture thinkers. And that's what visual spatial processing is. The next part of our regulatory box is auditory processing. Just like visual processing, this is our ability not just to hear, but instead our ability to understand what we hear. So again, as an adult, we may be receiving instructions from someone. We might even be preoccupied with another activity, such as watching TV. Well, if we're preoccupied with something, we may hear the instructions quite well. such as, don't forget to turn off the oven in 10 minutes. Well, we might even repeat back, yeah, 10 minutes, turn off the oven. 15 minutes later, the oven is still on. Why is that? It's not that we didn't hear, and it's not that we necessarily forgot, because as soon as someone says you didn't turn off the oven, immediately it's right there. Well, what really happened is we didn't actively process the information. We didn't really think about what we were doing, because where was our engagement? Our engagement was somewhere else. Well, this is true of many children. Imagine a child who's playing with a toy, doing a puzzle, or even looking at an iPad, unfortunately. These children are more engaged and preoccupied with what's right in front of them. And when we call their name or we give them an instruction, there's very little response or follow through. So what we need to do is make sure that if we're going to be helping a child be processing auditory information, they have to be engaged first. I had a parent come to me one time and says, I'm worried my son isn't responding to his name. I said, okay, well, let's see. He was playing with a truck, and I said, okay, call his name. Mom called his name. She had a lot of enthusiasm, but he still didn't respond. I said, now, Mom, where is his focus? Where is his engagement? Would you say he's really aware of what's going on around him, or is he more hyper-focusing on this activity? She said, well, he's very focused. I said, absolutely. Well, when we learn from our environment, and as adults, what we need to do is not just focus on one thing. We need to focus on everything that's going on around us that's relevant and ignore the irrelevant. But only doing one thing at a time isn't really productive. So for this child, I said, Mom, go down and join his play. Start playing with your own truck. And Mom went down, she drove her truck around, and immediately he looked at her. I said, now, Mom, drive your truck back to your chair and sit in the chair and then call his name. Immediately, Mom followed through. She drove the truck. He watched her, and Mom sat in the chair. He was still watching her, and as he started to go look back at his truck, she called his name. And immediately, he popped up and walked right over to her. Why? Because now he was engaged and he was processing. But processing sometimes is about engagement. Sometimes we really don't have the right wiring. But in either case, we can improve processing by making sure a child is motivated and engaged more of the time. The last part of regulation that we're going to talk about is emotional modulation. Now, we already talked about sensory modulation. And sensory modulation was taking in sensory-based information and responding to it in a proportionate manner. Well, emotional modulation is the same thing, except it involves our emotions. So we take in emotional stimulus and we have a proportionate response. One of the examples of where this doesn't go well is for many children during the terrible twos. What happens when they hear no for the first time, or they have that boundary or limit set? Well, now the child, instead of having a proportionate response and realizing, hey, it's not the end of the world, now they have a much more extreme reaction. And now that reaction is disproportionate. This can happen from their own experiences, from hearing things like no or stop, or even getting just that frown from mom or dad, and now they have a meltdown. Or it can happen from experiencing another child's emotional stimulation, where the other child is crying or upset or gets hurt, and they have a disproportionate or inappropriate reaction. So with emotional modulation, the goal again is to keep things balanced, organized. Many children are hypersensitive to negative emotional stimulus and a little underreactive to positive emotional stimulus. And let's see just how that would play out, because we have an example on the screen that's about to happen. Because regulation, the way I want you to think about it, this foundation system, it functions much like a scale. So if you see now below, the scale is tilted. The scale has now shifted and it's experiencing some negative emotional input. Well, this negative experience has created dysregulation. How would we then get a child to be balanced again? Now we're going to give them positive emotional input. Well, this positive emotional input is balancing them out. They get upset, we soothe them. Well, a child who has regulation difficulties, their system is going to be shifted like this. And instead of actually having a balanced system, they're going to be far more hypersensitive to the negative experience. So now the positive experience doesn't balance the scale out. We give them more positive experience. It still doesn't balance it out. We give them more positive experience. And now finally, they're balanced out. But this isn't really a good long-term solution. Because this is the child now, they have a little bit of more negativity and they're dysregulated again. And we're walking on eggshells to try and not upset them. The question is, how do we get this whole system to shift back? How do we make a hypersensitive child less sensitive? Well, the most important thing we have to do is help them really become emotionally mature. But the real question is, how do we as individuals emotionally mature? Is it just having experiences? Unfortunately not, because we don't learn from every experience. It's actually having experiences that we then learn to communicate and symbolize. Because through symbolizing experiences, we learn more information about them. And through learning and symbolizing, we understand better. And understanding leads to essentially control. So now we have a child who's learning to communicate, they're regulating their emotions better, and now they can tolerate more. So what does this look like? Well, this is a very simple solution I'm going to put on the screen, but this is truly a floor time program. Because what is floor time but a intervention meant to improve communication and symbolizing our different emotional, relevant experiences? If we can't symbolize these things, we're more likely to be action-oriented actors. But if we learn to communicate and symbolize our experiences, our opinions, and our emotions, now we communicate instead of react physically. So now that we have a balanced scale, let's talk about the milestones. This is the trunk of the tree, the developmental elements. The first milestone is shared attention. Shared attention is our ability to attend to our environment in a shared manner. It's not attending just to a truck or a puzzle or a book. It's the ability to attend to a lecture while also looking at the screen and taking notes. Now you're attending to multiple facets of the environment while also ignoring the phone in the background or the sound of the fan or someone clicking their pen next to you. Well, each of these instances, our learning in life depends on our ability to filter out the irrelevant and focus on the relevant. But what really dictates that? Our motivation. We don't just learn to do this naturally. It happens because we apply this principle early in life to things that we're very motivated to focus on. Our mommy and daddy playing a game with us, for example, or our sibling or friend. And that's where it begins and strengthens, just like a muscle. The more we use it, the stronger it gets. And now we can attend to our environment all the time. But when we start attending to the environment, we want to take things further. And it's not just about attending. Then eventually it's about engaging with people, because I don't just want to pay attention to people, I want to really build a connection with them. Well, engagement is no longer just being aware of the people around you and wanting them near you, but instead it's allowing them to really build an emotional connection, become related and warm with them, and really look at them and take in all of the emotional feedback that they have to offer. If you're not engaged, you can't take in all that information. Well, this does require things like eye contact and facial gesturing, but we don't look at someone all the time, nor should we require a child to. So eye contact is only part of it. But the rest of it is the emotional connection. But with engagement, what's really important is that the person is the most relevant part of the activity, not the toy. And now we know the child is really engaged. But how do we even take things further? Because we don't just want a child to be looking at us. We don't just want a child to be smiling at us. We want to take things to the communication levels. Well, if a child smiles at me, I smile back. And what does that really bring? Well, that is the beginning of two-way communication. And two-way communication is the beginning of when children start to be responding, but also initiating these types of interactive circles. So if I smile at you, I've opened a circle, and you smile back, you've closed a circle. This is what we want to do in terms of children's earliest development with communicating. In the first 9 months of life, children should master this level of communication where we have a reciprocal interaction. The child may initiate by smiling and we smile back, or we may initiate by offering a toy or a bottle and they take it from us and they close the circle. So as a child learns to interact and exchange these interactive rhythms, we start developing not just the ability to communicate, but we deepen the relationship. And one of the things that we see is that especially when children start initiating, when they really start becoming more assertive, not only is their communication improving, but they feel more confident. Because if I can get mommy's attention, if I can get daddy's attention, if I can get my needs met, I feel much more in control of the world around me. So now look at the screen and you'll see that actually their regulation improves as they start moving into that fourth milestone. Because being initiative and assertive leads us to problem solving, which is the fourth milestone. Social problem solving, being able to get someone's help, push someone's hand away, take someone's hand to the door, and get out of the room. All of these are social problem-solving situations where we're not just climbing up a ladder to get a toy, we're using a person to accomplish our goals and needs, and that's another higher form of communication. And not only do we want to be able to come with one solution in order to be a good problem solver, but a good problem solver comes up with many solutions. And if one solution doesn't work, we come up with a secondary or a third solution. If mommy can't help us, we go to daddy. If daddy can't help us, we might talk to sister or brother, etc. So what's important here is we become dynamic with our problem solving. And what that requires is a much longer exchange. And that's what the continuous flow of interaction is. So as our interactions become longer, the continuous flow occurs. And this is when the interaction is going for 20, 30, 40, even 50 circles of back and forth exchanges. Well, imagine if I have to use that many circles to solve a problem. What do you think would be more efficient than grabbing someone by the hand, pushing their hand, leading them, pulling them, doing all of these gestures? Well, now we want to start developing words. And when we start developing words to symbolize our ideas, that's when we become a higher level communicator. We become symbolic and meaningful. So when we start communicating symbolically, this is where we really go from being more action-oriented thinkers to verbal communicators. And this is when behavior often changes. And once again, happened to our regulatory box at the bottom, it's gotten bigger. And you'll see each subsequent level, regulation improves because now we're becoming a better communicator, i.e. more emotionally mature, especially if our communication is tied into our emotions. So now, with our symbolic and meaningful language, we're communicating things like opinions, wants, needs, and eventually different emotions. But usually this starts very simply, and it starts with just singular ideas. But we have to take this further. And when we take this further, we don't just want to communicate one idea, we want to communicate two ideas. And this allows us to get into the sixth milestone, which is logical thinking. Logical thinking is being able to answer the who, what, when, where, why questions and connect two ideas together, and helps us to organize the world around us and make sense of things in a more dynamic fashion, because now I can hold more information together and I can even do things like start telling stories and giving multiple ideas of what I want to do, why I want to do it, where I want to go, etc. Well, the real reason we're talking about these 6 milestones is because these 6 milestones are developing within the first 3.5 to 4 years of life. Well, around 4 years of life, we want to start moving into more academic settings, start getting into preschool, socializing with friends, doing things like reading and math. But without these 6 fundamental milestones developing the trunk of our tree, it's very difficult to do these things. So what does this allow us to do? And if we use the metaphor of the tree, we now see the branches emerge. So we have math, oral and written expression, social skills, abstract reasoning, and reading comprehension, not just decoding. These are the branches of the tree. And we see that if we can establish regulation, develop up through the milestones, then we can have academic and social success. But for so many children who don't have those earlier levels, or they have holes in them, we see that behavior, socialization, and academics are things that they continue to struggle with. So we have to go back and fill in those holes to really have complete development. So let's see how this looks as the tree. So here's our learning tree. And you see the roots, the trunk, and you see the outcomes. You see different emotional outcomes and academic outcomes. But the other question is, how does a tree grow? Does a tree just grow in isolation? Does it need anything? And also, does a child need anything? Well, the truth is, yes, they both need things. So we see that a child and a tree both need relationships. They need a nurturing and healthy environment, and they need nurturing and healthy people. Well, trees don't always need people, but it helps, as you can see in the picture. But a tree needs sun, water, soil. A child needs healthy food, no toxins in the environment. They need support, soothing, emotional input that comes from people, and positive, healthy relationships. All of these things are how children learn. And through developing these milestones and working with a child on their level, we actually deepen these relationships. And it's through a Floor Time program that we see a child is really able to nurture and deepen these relationships and develop motivation to learn from the environment around them. There are other ways to do this as well, but they do require personally positive relationships. And without those relationships, we're not going to get the same learning in place. And my father, Dr. Greenspan, was one of the first people to say that children at birth are born with emotional systems, and these emotional systems need to be nurtured. And if we can nurture them, we really see that through these relationships, that the sky can be the limit for many children. But we have to provide them with the nurturing and support that a child needs. And one of the best ways we've found to do that is a floor time program.